Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza was on the Chris Hayes show last night, All In, basically doubling down on the activists' attacks on Bernie Sanders. Let's listen to her and talk about it on the other side.
So Black Lives Matter. What's your response to that?
Well, I have a few responses, and I think the first one is to, just for the record, say that both Sanders and O'Malley have been interrupted. It has not just been Sanders. And that interruption really forced Bernie Sanders to have a strong platform on race and racial justice and criminal justice. And it can get much stronger. And so we should really be thanking activists who have taken the risk to make sure that our lives are represented in every candidate's platform. And that is our plan from now leading up to 2016. So I think the other thing that's important just to acknowledge is that bird dogging and disruption is about as American as apple pie. But when we talk about bird dogging where folks like Code Pink or ACT UP, mostly white folks, are disrupting the president, they're disrupting business as usual, we don't see the same level of vitriol that we've seen against Black Lives Matter protesters who are doing exactly the same thing.
Okay, now she mentions ACT UP and Code Pink, and she says that disruption, political events or events is as American as apple pie, and no one has said anything about those two particular groups that she named. And of course, Chris Hayes goes on to say that ACT UP did get some pushback. But I think the main thing that she refuses to acknowledge is that in most cases, when someone is disrupting an event, it's not the event of an ally. That's where the pushback is coming from with Black Lives activists. Bernie Sanders is an ally. Bernie Sanders has a proven record of supporting black causes.
They're in a primary. And one of the things I found fascinating about the netrootation thing is O'Malley and Sanders were disrupted at that event, right? Hillary Clinton didn't get disrupted because she wasn't there, right? So it ends up creating somewhat perverse incentives to be as sort of hunkered down as possible, right? So if you got the Secret Service retinue, like the event today in New Hampshire, if you don't show up at Netroots Nation, maybe you could avoid it, and then a day later you can come out with a perfectly good statement about Black Lives Matter because you didn't have to deal with it in the moment. Like, do you worry about that tactically, creating the incentives in which the front runner in this race, I think it's fair to say, sort of ends up with this kind of added benefit?
Let me say this.
Okay, let me pause here for just a second. Whenever you hear somebody say, let me say this, on the heels of a question, that means they're not going to answer your question. And she didn't answer his question.
The cycle is going to be pushed, and the tactics are not all going to look the same, but we are going to make sure that every single candidate addresses what their plan is to make sure that we can breathe, to make sure that our lives do actually matter. And I want to be really clear, with Bernie Sanders, yes, he is someone that people on the left really like. But we have to be honest. When he was asked whether or not Black Lives mattered at the Netroots Nation conference, this is someone who spent 50 years fighting for civil rights, right? We've heard this many times. He could not and did not actually say Black Lives Matter until he was pushed. So again, we have to be really, really clear here that if there isn't disruption and if our friends and our enemies are not pushed around this question of whether or not Black Lives Matter, and not just whether, but what they plan to do in order to ensure that Black Lives Matter, we won't see it. And so we are going to continue at every step of the way to make sure that each of these candidates feels accountable to ensuring that Black Lives matter.
Now, I take issue with this a little bit as well. First, she says, okay, Bernie Sanders is someone on the left that people like. Well, African Americans should like Bernie as well for the actions he took in the 60s when it was not politically popular to do such a thing, particularly as a white person. So for her just to kind of dismiss that, oh, they like him on the left, is kind of wrong. I don't think she's done her history, and she's been a little bullheaded in reference to that. And then when you want to hold Bernie to task for not saying a phrase or two when his actions should have spoken louder than his words. You know, it's the same argument that I make against Republicans or conservatives when they want to hold the president to task for not saying the words radical Islam. I mean, this is just another form of that. Oh, since Bernie didn't say Black Lives Matter, it means he doesn't think Black Lives Matter, even though he marched in the 60s. It makes no freaking sense. And she's been so bullheaded, it just really just kind of pisses you off. It's like, you were wrong, admit you were wrong. You should never have been targeting Bernie Sanders in the first place, and you're too bullheaded to recognize that and admit to it. To hold someone accountable for not saying Black Lives Matter, some new phrase, an important phrase, don't get me wrong, but a new phrase, and you want to hold that on top of or above what his actions actually did or what his actions actually were, is just ridiculous. And, you know, just hate someone to sit there and intelligent young lady, no doubt, but bullheaded.